go.
Welcome to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill on 710 WOR.
Welcome. I am your host, Jeffrey Hill, right here on 710 WOR Radio in New York City. It's 8 a.m. in the morning on Sunday, so I hope you didn't have too difficult a night last night, because I know it's kind of early. On the other side...
Did.
I'm sorry, Flips.
I had a tough night.
Flipsy had a tough night. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, buddy, because you're on now, so hopefully you're going to get your act together, my brother. Okay, so there you go. I was going to introduce Flips on the other side of the glass, my producer. Also
I like jumping in to throw you off every once in a
Yeah,
while.
I know you do, but, come on. Direct hit, glancing blow. That's how we do it. All right, Flipsinator, let's get right into it. Normally, if you've been listening to my show, we kind of penetrate the whole New York sports thing, and I'm a Boston guy, he's a New York guy. We have a little fun with that, but not this time because, why? Well, how about this? It's UN week here in New York.
Hold on, the Giants finally win. You're going to bring up the UN?
Okay, all right. So let me just say this. Okay, Giants win. Mr. Manning finally sits, thank God, and the Giants do indeed win. Of course, the Patriots, destroy the Jets. That's neither here nor there. Okay, let's move on to the intellectual side of our personalities, please, Flipsy. All right. 90 chiefs of state are in town at the UN week, plus the president. Any thoughts on that?
It's traffic.
Traffic.
That's all that is. It's traffic.
Let me just say this. There's 9 million people living in New York City. About 100,000 are totally focused on what's going on there. And the other 8.9 million have the Flips response.
It's all about traffic.
Too much traffic. All right, how about this, Flips? The Wall Street Journal, the Times, and the Washington Post are all over the president for pressuring the head of the Ukraine to get opposition research, also known as Oppo, on Joe Biden's son. What do you think of that?
He did do it. The transcript just came out this week.
All right.
They released it on Tuesday.
Did you read it?
No.
Oh, of course you didn't. If you said yes, I would have had to
I think there was a whole paragraph about it.
I would have had to scrape myself up off the floor. Yeah. All right, let's let Flipsy go back to the board. And off we go. First, let's tell the folks how they can find us. We're available right here every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. on 710 WOR Radio in New York City. Then the show becomes available as a podcast on iHeartRadio and as an app on iTunes as well.
Soon to be Spotify.
Oh, soon to be Spotify as well. Okay, That's good news. See, this is what happens when your producer is completely independent. He does things and tells them about them on the air.
Well, I like breaking the news here.
There you go. Well, that's a little unusual, but I say thank you for that. So soon to be Spotify as well. That's exciting. All right, just search NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill. The show is also on Instagram at NYCBD Official and on Twitter and Facebook. We're also shooting the show live as a YouTube channel. Jimmy Cozier, who I've mentioned several times, one of the best songwriters in the universe, just ask him, and his team, just kidding, are all here shooting the show. He promised me the YouTube video will be available at 10 a.m. every Sunday morning. That's 1 hour after the show is completed, and probably about the time most of you are thinking about getting out of bed, probably aren't out yet. So, if you'd like, just put on YouTube with a cup of coffee, and you can watch the show. There you go. So let's discuss the 4 segments of the show, which your helpful DMs have helped us finalize. The first segment is called Cannabis in the Tri-State +1. That's Massachusetts, where I'll update you on cannabis issues in these 4 states. Our second segment is called Stunning and Amazing Facts.
No trademark yet?
Okay.
I'm going to keep asking you every week.
All right. What I consider to be some of the most relevant issues and opportunities in the space today. Based on your comments, the focus of this segment will be my thoughts on national and international issues that impact the entire space. Having said that, each fact is called a
stunner.
There you go, Flips, right on target. I will attempt to educate and perhaps stun you just a bit. Of course, with Flips' total education, virtually everything is a stunner for him. Isn't that right, my brother?
Pretty much, yeah.
There you go. For our third segment, today's guest, it is my honor to bring David Champion to the show. I've known David for many years. He is a young, driven, and very health-focused young entrepreneur who is now focused on one of the most controversial but potentially game-changing drugs in medicine, psilocybin. typically coming from mushrooms.
So no cannabis or CBD this week.
Sorry, buddy.
That's good.
There's going to be a little of that, but we're
I
going
like
to have
it,
a little psilocybin. Okay, good. All right.
That's a little change.
So let me just say this, everyone, that David Champion and his partner Joel sold their company for a valuation of $250 million. So at the age of 31, I think he's a guy to be listened to. Lastly, we will end with our fourth segment called Your Messages, providing answers to the most interesting direct messages we received following last week's show. All right, we'll be back with our first segment right after this. Welcome back to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill, right here on 710 WOR Radio, every Sunday at 8 a.m. After the show airs, it is available on a podcast on iHeartRadio, all 122 million downloads, and iTunes, all 600 million apps, enabling users to listen to podcasts like mine whenever they choose. To put this in perspective, that being what's happening in the podcast world, in 2014, there were 7 billion actual podcasts downloaded. 7 billion, that's a B.
My mom's going to start one soon.
Oh, my God. In 16, there was 10.5 billion. In 17, it jumped to 13.7 billion. And if you can believe it, in 2018, as of March, right, which is a whole year ago, podcasts passed 50 billion all-time episode downloads and streams. Some of my friends say, Jeff, we can't find you. What should I say to them, Flipsy?
Just search NYCBD.
All right.
On iTunes, iHeart, soon to be Spotify.
Okay. How
Same
about
with
this?
YouTube.
How about I say to them, ask your children under 13 to help you.
That works too, yeah.
After all, that's what I do. My head of technology's name is Ian, Kyle, and Lucas. They're all my nephews. The oldest one is 16, the youngest one is 13, and they are my IT department.
Oh, by the way, happy birthday.
Yes, it was my birthday. That's very sweet of you to bring that up.
Yes, of course.
September 22nd.
That's Facebook told me.
What happened? Facebook told you. Of course it did, because you're under 13. Yeah. All right. So, right, I'm the last day of the Virgo.
Okay.
And on my way into the Libra.
Oh, okay.
Depends on how late I stay up that night. All right. Normally we go to our first segment, Cannabis in the Tri-State, plus one. But there has been very little news in these 4 states since last week's show, so I'll be integrating a few key facts about each of these states into our next segment, Stunning and Amazing Facts. So let's do it, shall we? All right, stunner number 1. The Attorney Generals of 21 states sent a letter to congressional leaders on Monday voicing support for a bipartisan bill that would shield state legal marijuana programs from federal interference. Led by Washington, D.C. Attorney General Karl Racine, along with the top law enforcement officials in New York and Nevada, the letter emphasizes that the act, called the States Act, would enable cannabis businesses to access financial services, increasing transparency and mitigating risks associated with operating on a largely cash-only basis. Passing the States Act would lift the cloud of regulatory uncertainty that hangs over legitimate businesses operating in 33 states and its several territories, and thereby reduce the industry's reliance on cash. This would likely bring greater clarity to the industry, prevent crime by limiting opportunities for potentially violent robberies and thefts, and ensure that each state has the freedom to determine policy in their area, the state officials wrote. Current federal law prevents banks from providing services to legal cannabis businesses, an industry expected to generate revenue between $50 and $80 billion over the next 10 years.
That's insane.
Just imagine that. $50 to $80 billion business, we want you to do it in $10s and $20 bills. All right. Our partisan coalition is urging Congress to pass the States Act because it would allow those in the legal cannabis industry to access the U.S. banking system, providing long overdue transparency and accountability, and deter criminal activity like robbery and money laundering.
Yeah, how bad is like the theft at the dispensaries?
I would say that there's an awful lot of security around these dispensaries, and so basically anybody that owns a dispensary is looking at somewhere between a $7 and $10 million grossing business, all done in cash.
Yeah,
you can imagine
that
you can imagine that there's a lot of security around, right? And they're going to the local bank with a bag of money like every hour.
Damn.
Of course, the intent of the States Act isn't exclusively about providing marijuana businesses with access to banking services. That represents one potential benefit for the industry, but the bill is generally about offering states broader protections so they can establish their own cannabis systems without fear of reprisal from the justice system. Quote, as law enforcement officers and as lawyers representing our states and territories, we believe the time has come to do better. We urge the adoption of legislation like the proposed States Act, close quote, officials said. All right, let's move on to stunner number 2. The Safe Banking Act, yet more on it, which would normalize banking for the cannabis industry, is expected to receive a House vote shortly. Despite opposition from some cannabis legalization and social justice groups, the Safe Banking Act is finally set for a House vote, Politico reports. One of the banking bill's sponsors, Representative Ed Perlmutter, Democrat from Colorado, said he believes he has 2/3 majority in the chamber, which would allow the measure to be passed with no amendments and limited debate. According to the report, the House version has been amended to include language specifically for hemp companies, likely included in part to get the attention of who? Well, how about Senator Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to increase the odds of the bill being voted on in the Senate, right? Why would they want Mr. McConnell, and why do they think he's in the game? Well, perhaps because he represents Kentucky, the number one hemp producers in the United States. It also includes language to prevent the revival of Operation Choke Point, a program enacted by former President Barack Obama that discouraged banks from doing business with the category. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
That's my girl right there.
I'm sure it is. Democrat from New York, who I understand is a very good salsa dancer.
Also very attractive.
Told Politico that she would likely vote no on the bill if it receives a vote before cannabis-related criminal justice legislation. More about that in a minute. That's a critically important no vote. The letter from activists sent to House leaders on Tuesday urged lawmakers to bring the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement, called MORE, Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment Expungement, MORE, Act up for a vote before the Safe Banking Act. So what are they saying? Some politicians are saying, I tell you what, banking is critical, right? We got 250,000 people employed in the space. We got 50,000 companies, and that number is at least 6 months old. So you could probably increase those numbers by 50%. Every one of these businesses has to do business in cash, and they're nervous about carrying all that cash. All right, so let's get that passed, right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe not. Because what the politicians want to do is to make sure that the MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, gets passed first. All right, that leads us to a related story, also known as stunner number 3. 4 Democratic presidential candidates and the party's top Senate leader are taking the stand that Congress should not pass marijuana banking legislation without also moving to end federal cannabis prohibition and repair the harms of the war on drugs. Well, what does that mean? That means make sure that the underprivileged community, typically black and brown, are given the chance to participate in all the licenses that are being offered in these states as essentially a payback, if you will, to the community that was most heavily impacted. All 4 lawmakers, Senators Cory Booker, Democrat from New Jersey, Kamala Harris, Democrat from California, Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, and Chuck Schumer, not running for president, thank goodness, Democrat from New York, tweeted regarding a growing dispute between legalization supporters who say the banking bill is a first step that will bolster broader cannabis reform. That's one point of view. And those that are concerned that passing the limited proposal, just that, will undermine efforts to advance more far-reaching legislation under the general heading of the equivalency or the MORE Act. The scheduling of the vote came over the objections of several advocacy groups, including the ACLU, Human Rights Watch, and Drug Policy Alliance. They wrote a letter asking that the vote be postponed until more wide-ranging reform legislation is passed. I'm proud to stand with these civil rights organizations, Sanders said. Kamala Harris said we shouldn't do this without addressing the reality of people of color and what they've been dealing with. Cory Booker said, he tweeted, marijuana legislation moving through Congress must include restorative justice. And Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said, we need decriminalization at the federal level. All right. Well, I agree with all those things. But like I always say, ladies and gentlemen, you can't swallow the ocean or you can't drink from a fire hydrant. Flips, you can steal both of those if you'd like. So let's do one at a time, ladies and gentlemen. How about we approve the States Act and then go back and deal with all the social justice issues?
Just get it done already.
Yes, you're darn right. I won't even deal with the 280E tax code, which makes it illegal to deduct normal and customary business expenses. So in cannabis, guess what the effective tax rate is in a cannabis business? 70%. Any of you business guys want to get involved in that? Likely not. All right, let's look at the on-the-ground reality. Stunner number 4 in Massachusetts. The Commonwealth state, where I grew up, says social equity applicants, which is this whole notion of making sure that social equity is a priority when cannabis moves forward, have been stymied by the state's host community rules paired with a lack of funds. Oh, what a surprise. Cannabis Control Commission Chairman Stephen Hoffman said in an interview with Mass Live, of the 537 applications first submitted to the commission, how many came from economic empowerment applicants, those people, black or brown, that have been treated poorly by the space? 14. And from the 122 economic empowerment businesses given the priority status, only 28 were minority-owned. The biggest issue is they don't have enough money, Hoffman said in an interview, noting that if a lender is willing to invest in a cannabis business, they will not lend to someone who lives in Boston, has a criminal record, and, this is him quoting, not me, $8 of net worth. Important statement. Hoffman also said that the host community agreements, which require businesses to pay a 3% community impact fee, also pose problems for social equity applicants because larger businesses can and do pay more than the 3% required by law. Those host agreements have come under fire recently after the arrest of Fall River Mayor Jasiel Carrero, who allegedly used the host government agreement, or the host agreement, to extort tens of thousands of dollars from cannabis companies. I believe the actual number is closer to $500,000, as I reported on a previous show. It does give a disproportionate advantage to bigger companies that can afford to throw in a fire truck on top of their 3%, Hoffman said. All right, I guess Hoffman wants his own show. All right, clearly he is quite a funny man. All right, so to the three folks running for president, Mr. Sanders, Ms. Harris, Mr. Booker, and the Senate Majority Leader, Mr. Schumer, perhaps a little bit more thought needs to go into your campaign speeches before you hold up legislation impacting owners and employees of cannabis businesses in 33 states. All right, let's move on to stunner number 5. Congress should reclassify marijuana to help kids with cancer, lawmakers say. Marijuana's current Schedule I status under federal law is a cause of unnecessary distress and suffering for families of children with cancer, a congresswoman testified on Friday. As the mother of a 10-year-old daughter, I can tell you, that's not me, ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing worse than watching your child in pain, said Representative Elaine Luria, Democrat from Virginia. The unfortunate reality is that our outdated marijuana laws cause chronically ill children to suffer from unbearable bouts of pain every day. The lawmaker told the story of a 10-year-old girl from her district who had used medical cannabis to find relief from a rare form of brain cancer. Quote, over the last 4 years, Madison has had multiple major surgeries, severe bouts of pain, and very difficult treatments. Luria said during a Judiciary Committee meeting at which lawmakers could testify about their legislative interests and priorities under the panel's jurisdiction. After numerous treatments, Madison's family began to experiment with cannabis products to make life more bearable for her. And thankfully, it worked. Madison is now able to go to school, play with friends, and do things that most 10-year-olds obviously do. Today, she testified before the House Judiciary Committee, where she told the story and pushed the committee to endorse sensible and compassionate marijuana policies. It defies logic, science, and compassion that marijuana is classified as a Schedule I drug alongside heroin, said Congressman Luria. Okay, there you go. The most important, stunning, and amazing facts in this category. When we come back, we're going to introduce our guest, David Champion. 31-year-old Mr. Champion exited his last firm in a public offering after the company accomplished a $250 million valuation. So I suggest you stay with us to hear how he did it. Welcome back to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill, right here on 710 WOR Radio. After airing every Sunday at 8 a.m., the show moves as a podcast to iHeartRadio and iTunes. As you know, we're also on all social sites, including YouTube at NYCBD Official. And thanks to the famous flips, you no longer need a space between NYCBD and Official. And as I said earlier in the show, the YouTube video will be up at 10 a.m. every Sunday morning, 1 hour after the show ends. So you might have some friends and family interested in watching. Tell them they can do it. All right. We have a special treat in store for you all. His name is David Champion. I've known David for almost 10 years, having helped he and his partner Joel Milton, currently a president of an operating division of Tilt, a large cannabis company in the space. You may recall Joel was on this show several weeks ago. David has gone in a very different direction than his old partner Joel. In fact, David's focus is currently Unlimited Sciences, a research nonprofit discovering how psilocybin can be safely used for healing and cognition. Prior to that, as I said, David was co-founder and chief product development officer of Baker Technologies. Yes, he exited in a public offering after the company accomplished a valuation near $250 million. Not a bad move, David. He was brought up in Papua New Guinea, Portugal, and Scotland. Champion most recently lived in Kenya, where he founded an educational nonprofit in response to policies that unfairly excluded children from primary schooling. He graduated with first in his honors in architecture at Cambridge University shortly before moving to New York City to work with Daniel Libeskind on the Ground Zero Master Plan. He recently served as a campaign lead in the Denver Psilocybin Initiative, helping Denver become the first U.S. city to reform psilocybin policy. His primary interests are behavioral data, digital art, and user experience design. David, I can't believe how much you've accomplished at 31 years old. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jeff. It's great to be on.
All right. Well, it's good to have you with us. And once again, this is 2 weeks in a row. We've got, wonderful accents. So I know that the audience likes that because, after all, when you have an accent like yours, everybody thinks you are wiser. And indeed, in this case, you are. All right. So let's get started by telling us a little bit about your background and how you got into the cannabis space.
Well, about 10 years ago, I moved on from architecture and all excited by the buzz of New York entrepreneur scene. I thought, how can I apply my skills in this space? And the natural progression was as a designer. So I started designing, instead of user experiences of buildings, designing the user experience on the screen experience. And back then was actually when you and I met, and thank you for your guidance and wisdom back then in the tender, younger ages of my entrepreneurship. And
just for my audience's benefit, he was tenderly 25, and I was tenderly more like 50. Not so tender. Back to you.
So one thing led to another. Ended up building various technology suites and also consulting for other startups and companies that were trying to innovate in the app or website experience space. And in around 2014, Joel, who has been on your show and I owe this credit to, came to me and said, listen, there's something happening in Colorado. And I said, what? And he said, it's cannabis. And I have not been a cannabis user my entire life. I'd smoked one or two joints as a teenager, as a student. But after that, it just wasn't particularly interesting to me. And being in New York, it wasn't a very relevant conversation. And so when he brought this to me, I thought, well, that's not relevant to me. And I wasn't interested in it at all until doing the research and realizing what was about to unfold in Colorado. So we flew out, we met with several dispensary owners, we asked them what their challenges were, what their problems were, and the biggest issue at the time was that there was this influx of tourist traffic flooding the doors of every dispensary that was open. Meanwhile, your local regular customer who was trying to get medication for their back pain or for their headaches couldn't even get in the door. If they did, it was an hour wait, and they were just having a poor customer experience, which was driving them away back to the black market. So we saw that there was an opportunity to bring what we had seen work in other industries with on-demand services. So we thought at first of delivery, but that turns out wasn't allowed and still isn't in Colorado. But we were able to do one thing, which is let those local customers see what strains of cannabis were available, what products there were, beautiful photography, all the details about the cannabinoid profiles of each product, and to actually add a product to their cart from their mobile device, just like many of us do now for food or any other on-demand service. But at the time, it was a breakthrough for cannabis. It allowed dispensaries to keep their regular customers happy and then have that in-and-out experience that everyone wants.
Righto. So I want to make a point to the audience as we're chatting about this, because this is very consistent with a couple of other shows we've done. We did one show on businesses you can invest in without touching the plant. It was an entire show about all kinds of different dynamics in agronomy, agriculture, technology, etc. And what David has really done is he's just brought a technology that existed in many other what I'll call verticals or industries, which is the notion of kind of communicating to retail customers essentially what the offering is and doing it on the internet. Is that a fair statement, David?
Absolutely.
So as you guys are thinking about investments in the space, and as David goes deeper into this, because it's going to get a lot more interesting, right? Think about the kinds of things that he thought about. He's not a cannabis consumer, as he mentioned, right? He didn't really want to touch the plant. He came up with a brilliant idea that provided a value-added service, filled a consumer need, in this case a B2B need, right? He was providing it to businesses. They were providing it B2C directly to the consumer, right? And as a direct result of that, he built one very fascinating business along with his partner, Joel Milton, right? So well done. All right, so that's how you got into it. Now, help us a little bit about, kind of get us to the end, right? So you moved on from Baker Technologies after the Tilt kind of public offering, and take us from there into how you got where you are today, please.
Well, I have to say, even back then at the early days of Baker, I wasn't a cannabis user, and I still am not. But I did have a very powerful experience just over the course of 2 days where I designed our entire brand suite using a single hit of a sativa vape pen. And that was one of my only intentional THC experiences in my entire life, but I made it so intentional that I was able to produce something that I had been banging my head against the wall for weeks on. And at that time, I became interested in this idea, what problems can we solve when we access this different state of mind? They call it an altered state of consciousness. And what it brings, in my experience, is lateral thinking and creative problem solving, which most of the time we just don't have as much access to. And that was way back at the beginning of Baker, but the thought percolated. And as I came into contact with other classic psychedelics, including psilocybin, I really started to wonder where the potential is for this concept of having an already sharp mind be enhanced even further with the help of psychedelics. And one of my future dreams that I'm not shy to share publicly is that there will be a facility, and I hope to create this in my future, a facility for some of the smartest scientists in the world working on extremely complex problems and having challenges solving those problems, to come into an environment where they can responsibly be trained on psychedelics and then administered under close supervision a specific psychedelic relevant to accessing the mindset that they may need to solve that problem. And my goal is that we'll be able to solve climate change problems and implement solutions using these tools to help our greatest scientists do their best work.
Okay, well, that's a lofty mission. Let me, and I think it's very exciting, and certainly somebody that's got like a 45-year runway of career ahead of you can probably achieve much of that, especially given your track record of basically setting your mind to something and getting it done. Let me give a little bit of perspective to the audience. When David said he intentionally consumed sativa, there's two basic types of marijuana that are often referred to. One is sativa, which is typically associated with elevated intention, elevated kind of, some of my friends refer to it as clean the garage, The clean the garage version, that means you kind of get energized and focused. There's another one, which I frankly take nightly before bed. I used to take Ambien. I no longer take Ambien. I need help sleeping occasionally. I know that surprises most of my audience because you guys all thought I was a very relaxed individual. But anyway, that's referred to as indica. So when David says that he proactively pursued a 2-day activity to get his business plan done, he chose to get sativa to help him kind of focus and provided him a little bit more impetus to finish that task. Many of you may remember in college the things you did for all-nighters. Well, now we've got sativa, and to bed at night, we've got indica. All right, let's move on from there. I want to bring a sense of kind of reality to what you're describing because a lot of the audience is going to be very confused. This notion of psilocybin, yet another Schedule 1 drug at one point, indeed Schedule 1 today currently, meaning federally illegal, right? However, Colorado, of course, has made it legal for study and investigation. In addition to that, Johns Hopkins University has recently gotten a $17 million grant to study this category, and they've got over 60 published documents already done over the last several years. So a couple things. Start out by talking about your current focus and your 501c3 called Unlimited Sciences, what that does, who's it working with, and kind of bring us into the academic community because I know that's a very big part of your focus.
Great, I'd love to. I'll just start by augmenting one thing you said, that decriminalization of psilocybin we just passed in Denver. Colorado hasn't yet put in place their plan, but Denver is now decriminalized for people to use psilocybin for personal consumption. So going back to Unlimited Sciences, we started this organization about a year ago, and the goal was that we could partner with academic organizations to help bring their work and augment their work for the real world scenario. And again, I want to really acknowledge that many people are not aware even of how psilocybin affects the brain. They're not aware of some of the benefits it offers. And I'm happy to give a little bit of background about psilocybin if that would be helpful for your audience.
I think it would be, but if you could do it kind of at the appropriate level and somewhat concisely, that'd be extremely helpful. Please do it.
On the surface, it produces a mental state that is temporary. It's about 4 to 6 hours long, and it distorts your visual field. It can change the way you think about your life or about existence itself. And in many cases, it's shown to have very powerful healing. And what I'll talk a little more about is the clinical trials for psilocybin's very, very high potential for helping people with depression, with anxiety, addiction, end-of-life distress, so many other conditions that are still being discovered, and much more research will be done in this space.
Right. Let me just underscore that, because this is the reason why we're doing it. This is kind of a message to my audience here. Everything that David just said, depression, anxiety, and a number of other challenging disease states, is being evaluated by a number of folks like David and academic communities, like he's going to describe in a moment. And so, as we've said so many times, everything we're doing on this show is to bring unique, somewhat far-reaching, health-focused science to the table. And this, perhaps, is the most far-reaching of anything we've done up to now. Thank you, David. Continue, please.
So, as Johns Hopkins discovered, the biggest positive impact that people feel from a psilocybin session is had when that session is in a safe environment, is in a context and a setting where the participant is familiar with the people that they're with. There's a lot of preparation that goes into those participants having the right mental state and checking, obviously, for any background interference that might come into play. And so what our research is looking into is what other characteristics of that psilocybin session can be controlled to make sure that somebody has the most positive outcome possible, and more importantly, will avoid any potential harmful outcome.
Very helpful. So let's add to this conversation another name if we can. We had one of the truly philanthropic leaders in the space on the show. Her name is Heather Jackson. She, along with the Stanley brothers and some very other important individuals, the Stanleys, of course, were the impetus behind CW Hemp, which has gone public and had a valuation well into the billions. All right. Well, Heather was named head of the ROC, Realm of Caring, which when she was on the air, she talked about helping 53,000 families with basically free cannabis product to help them with everything from epilepsy, autism, PTSD, depression, anxiety, and a number of other things. It's my understanding she's stepped down from executive director of the Realm of Caring after she's done that for many years and really done wonderful yeoman work. And she is now working with you on the psilocybin project. Could you explain that just a bit?
Heather is incredible. What she's done with the Rock has helped, as you mentioned, I think it's up to 57,000 families now who have children or members of their family suffering with epilepsy and autism and anxiety and others. And she has done a huge job in destigmatizing the use of CBD as a very real solution for some of these problems, and certainly a huge help to the caretakers. And so her experience there revolved around this observational research registry, and it was really her experience of 7 years proving from the data that she was able to collect from that research registry how helpful CBD can be, but also where it's helpful and perhaps where it's not helpful. And so that model proved its success with her Realm of Caring work. And when she joined the team or co-founded Unlimited Sciences with me, we immediately started talking about a very similar model for our research into psilocybin. And she's been amazing.
Very, very helpful. So let's talk a little bit about the two sides of the business that you're generating. And you might have to correct me on this one. You've got a philanthropic focus, and you're thinking about a longer-term for-profit side of the business. I think they might even have a couple of different names associated with them. Would you share that a little bit with the audience, as much as you're comfortable with, please?
I'm happy to. First correction there is that the for-profit is registering as a B Corp, a public benefit corporation in Colorado, and will be B Corp certified. And the goal there is to make sure our team members, our investors, and any partners we work with are really aligned behind this mission, that even though we will be a venture-backed company and we need to do that in order to build an expensive piece of technology, that our incentives are aligned behind providing benefit to the communities of people experiencing anxiety and depression. And so to that end, the tool is an app. It will go in a consumer's pocket, and we're building this tool to allow people who are choosing to use psilocybin to help overcome their depression and anxiety, and to offer the sense of guidance that those people need in order to do that safely. So it's important to say we're not advising anyone to use psilocybin. We're certainly not telling them when to do that or if their conditions are right for using psilocybin. But if somebody volunteers that they are choosing to use psilocybin, and in many parts of the world that's actually legal and perfectly fine activity, they will be able to use our app to get this data-driven knowledge around how they can do that. And so the app is in and of itself meant to be a companion to somebody who, especially folks experiencing anxiety and depression, may often feel lonely, dislocated from society, don't have the support group around them that we all wish we had. And this app will help provide some of that, as well as the best practices, the latest knowledge and thinking from the scientific community around how psilocybin can be used effectively.
Excellent. So essentially we should think of this app kind of as the entire, almost like education on the industry, what science is doing, what Johns Hopkins is doing, what you're finding, as one component of the app, an information-based app, if you will, the WeedMD of psilocybin. And then on top of that, there's how to go through the protocol, how to go through the process, and perhaps even feeling like there's a bit of a therapist kind of with you during the exercise. Is that a fair statement?
That's fair, and not ever to replace the therapist. In fact, the app will be of service in connecting individuals with nearby therapists, and will always be presenting the first option as seek professional guidance, seek professional help in your area. We'll connect with local therapists to understand this type of
Excellent. So it's going to augment that whole protocol, and it'll be an app that'll encourage compliance and education, etc. And to your point, reinforce the most important constituent perhaps in the mix, which is the therapist that will obviously be the professional engaged. Let me ask you this, if I may.
Completely anonymously. Yeah, anonymity and data privacy, data security, all front of mind and top priority for us.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. And, for anybody that's listening to what we're just describing here, obviously these are very intriguing, very far-reaching conversations, and the whole notion of privacy and handling names and discussions very delicately, of course, is part of all these businesses. Helpful. You mentioned international use, where it's legal and has been used for an extended period of time. Could you just touch on some other countries, perhaps the years of use, i.e. several thousand years of use in many countries in this space? Just touch on that for 30 seconds or so that people understand this is not a new idea. This has been going back as cannabis is going back for 6,000 years. That's the cannabis number. I'm not sure what the psilocybin number is, but I do know it's had broad use in a number of countries. Perhaps you could just touch on that, please.
Well, I believe historians think psilocybin has been used for as far as 9,000 years. There are certain theories that it's been used for far, far longer than that and has played a part in our evolution of language as a species as we developed from early hominid. I won't go into that because that's still a controversial theory, but definitely interesting to research if anyone out there would like to know more about that. And since then, we've had examples of ceremonial, ritualistic use of psilocybin in cultures as far back as 9,000 years in Africa. Early ancient Grecian cultures have shown archaeological evidence of mushroom use, and then certainly more recently in Aztec and Mayan cultures. And in fact, the contemporary use of psilocybin was only brought about in the West, in America, in around 1950, and it was after an ethnomycologist went down to Mexico and he came into contact with a ceremonial use of psilocybin mushrooms with a woman called Maria Sabina, who's now become a bit of a sort of a famous figure in the space, and he brought back this story of how his experience there was so powerful. And that's where in the early 1950s, psilocybin entered American culture, and it showed so much promise. It was first written about in the tabloid press as a real cure for many mental illnesses. And unfortunately, as with many things, culture sort of took that over. It started to become overused, started to be used in very irresponsible ways and by people who weren't fully educated. And then very quickly, by the end of the 1960s and the Illegal Substances Act in 1970, it was made illegal. And shortly after that, all promising research in the psychotherapeutic field had to stop. And so that research did continue underground, but only recently was it revived.
Right. So let me just kind of put meat on that bone. First of all, 9,000 years, ladies and gentlemen, is kind of the number that was being used. In the case of cannabis, we've got it going back 6,000 years, and we've talked about that number multiple times on the show. I've also opened the show, or just opened the segment before David jumped on, talking about the notion that says that the power of plants and the power of herbs have been around since the beginning of medicine, which dates back literally thousands of years. For various reasons, certain countries have made these herbs or plants illegal, and we talked about why cannabis was made illegal multiple times on this show, and you just heard from David some of the dynamics and some of the history, the chronology of why psilocybin and other psychedelics were made illegal. Having said all of that, where science is now heading is to go back and review what is effectively Schedule I drugs oftentimes and see what the validity of these drugs are on critical disease states like epilepsy, autism, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and many others. And so I love having guys like David on the show because he is an expert in the space, in both spaces, both cannabis, which he's now moved on from, and that, of course, he did not touch the plant, but he knew the category quite well. And now he's moved into psychedelics and specifically psilocybin. So let me ask you this, David. Realistically, when do you think psilocybin might be used more broadly in treating patients? Is there a milestone? Is there an FDA activity? Is there a study? Is it Johns Hopkins and you together that are going to try to drive that? What's your thinking there?
Johns Hopkins is definitely doing the most relevant work in that space, and they're working with the FDA in a very collaborative manner. It's actually inspiring to see that that can happen and that real research can guide the FDA's regulations. And I think they're discussing somewhere in the region of 4 to 6 years out, psilocybin can be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 4. Would it be helpful for me to explain a little about what that means?
Well, I'd love you to, but unfortunately, I'm getting a little bit of a hook here from my good friend, Mr. Flips, behind the glass. So what I'm going to do is suggest this. I'm going to ask you one more question, but I also want to let the audience know that we had Lou Sager on twice, I believe. And Lou is the CEO, founder of Alchemist Kitchen, along with a group called Evolver, which is the kind of the holding company of the enterprise. These folks are also very focused on the power of plants and herbs. In fact, his entire focus with Alchemist Kitchen is the power of plants, literally the healthcare implication of plants. David has met Lou, and we've had this conversation because they're both believing in the far-reaching implication of plants and herbs, and of course, mushroom is part of that, right? So what I'd like to do is invite you back with Lou, and perhaps the three of us can get into this in a little bit more depth, and we can take the audience from what you've been kind enough to do up to now, which I'll call, up to level 3, so to speak, and bring them into a little bit more of an educated state. But unfortunately, today is not the day. I do have one question for you that I'd like you to kind of leave the audience with. And that is to say that, first of all, I'd like to thank you for, participating, because I love having you on the show, and I really enjoy listening to you because you're one of the true students in the space. If you had to wrap up with whatever you'd like to say to the audience, you have the floor. Why don't you kind of provide whatever conclusions you would like and next steps?
Well, first, thank you for having me on. Really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for your show. I think bringing this kind of research-backed and experience-backed information to the audience is so helpful for these fields of study and business. So thank you for what you do, Jeff. And I'll just plug that unlimitedsciences.org is our website. We are a nonprofit. We are accepting donations, and we feel that this use of funds is one of the most helpful and far-reaching ways for us to really understand how psilocybin can be used to help people with depression, anxiety, other mental illnesses, PTSD, and so on. So thank you for letting me share.
I tell you what, David, at the risk of giving you yet more airtime, why don't you repeat that website again, please, so my audience kind of pays a little bit more attention. Go ahead, please.
It is unlimitedsciences.org.
All right, great. All right. Obviously, David, we could go on for quite some time, and I do want you to have you come back with Lou, who I know you've met, and you guys have had very enjoyable conversations up to now. All right. Well, we could go on for quite some time, David. I've truly enjoyed the conversation and having you on the show, and I'd like to reiterate my invitation to have you, along with Lou Sager of Alchemist Kitchen and myself, try to take the audience to a new level.
I'd love that. Thank you, Jeff.
All right. Well, thank you, David. When we come back, the last segment of the show, responding to your messages, is up next. Welcome back to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill, right here on 710 WOR Radio, every Sunday at 8 a.m., also available on iHeartRadio and iTunes. We're also available on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at NYCBD Official. Don't forget, I write a blog. Each post can be read in under 3 minutes. Flips gave me the rule. He said 3 minutes or less, Jeff. That's all I can maintain my focus. So there you go. I call them the Flipsy blogs. All right. The blog covers the critical issues in the space. I'm up to 60 some odd, so catch up before it's too late. My blog is medium.com/@JeffreyHill2. That's medium.com/@JeffreyHill2. All right, now let's move on to our last segment, the fourth segment, responding to your messages. We've only got a couple, so let's go quickly. These are the best messages handpicked by the Flips and I. The first one comes from Sue in New Jersey. I watched as our Governor Murphy campaigned on adult use commitment for New Jersey within 100 days of his administration. He even quoted a number of $40 million in incremental taxes in his first year. Clearly, he missed that. What is your prognosis going forward? Well, Sue, your governor made a challenging move in your state. He frankly irritated the head of the state Senate, President Stephen Sweeney, Democrat from Gloucester, and Assembly Speaker Craig Coughlin, Democrat from Middlesex. As soon as he took office, he increased licenses in your state by executive order, something the State House and Senate frown upon. So when it came time to secure agreement on how adult use cannabis would be handled in your state, there was a war. Governor Murphy lost, and then there was a lot of finger-pointing between the governor and both houses in New Jersey. Stay tuned, Sue. NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill will be keeping track of this interesting debate each week in our Cannabis in the Tri-State Plus One segment. Our next DM comes from Marcus in New York, who says, New York is struggling with this vaping thing, and CBD food produced in commercial kitchens has also been made illegal. Governor Cuomo has projected a $400 million increase in the budget originally in 2020 due to adult use cannabis. Where does that stand now? By that, he's referring to the tax, of course. Answer, stuck in your political machine in Albany. Basically, there was so much derision in the New York State House that they simply ran out of time. I love that. Ran out of time. This is a football game. 2 minutes to go. They went into the 2-minute program, and guess what? They didn't score. They ran out of time. Keep in mind, Marcus, once the State House approves the measure, which will eventually approve it in New York, it typically takes at least 2 years to go through the agreements at the municipality level. License procedures must be put in place, applications developed and filed, approvals, etc. So my guess is, best case, New York is 2.5 years away from selling its first adult-use cannabis product. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's show and our guest, David Champion of Unlimited Sciences. We'll be back next week for another 60 minutes of the critical issues facing cannabis and CBD, the medical implications, the political implications, and the financial implications. Remember, knowledge is built brick by brick. Today you got my 20th brick. Until next week, this is NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill.